He was a billionaire CEO, used to getting everything he wanted. She was a quiet secretary, hidden behind a forgotten desk in a fading government building. They should have never crossed paths. But one rainy afternoon in Charleston, they did. It wasn't love at first sight. There were no grand gestures, no sweeping confessions, just a pen, a hallway, and a word, only 2 letters long, that would change both their lives forever. Why did this powerful man walk away from one of the biggest deals of his career? Because of a woman who told him no. Why did she choose to stay in a world everyone else was trying to escape? And how did their quiet Thursdays turn into something that would reshape a community and their hearts? This isn't a story about falling in love. It's a story about recognizing it when it's quiet, about how sometimes the strongest word you can say is no. And the most powerful thing someone can do is listen. If you believe in slow stories, healing moments, and love that grows in silence, like, share, and subscribe to follow this story through to the very last cup of tea. Now, let's begin. Some people walk into our lives without knocking. For Eleanor Harper, it was a cold gust of wind that pushed open the front door, and with it, a man who didn't belong in her quiet world. It was a Thursday in late October, and Charleston had finally surrendered to autumn. The air outside was crisp, tinged with wood smoke and the salty scent of the harbor. The city's historic district, with its cobblestone streets and pastel-painted townhomes, looks like a postcard. But inside the old county building on Broad Street, time didn't flow so elegantly. It lingered. The walls were stained with decades of humid summers. The windows rattled when the wind blew through, and the heat when it worked carried a faint hiss, like the sigh of someone tired of being asked for anything more. Ellie Harper sat at her desk on the 3rd floor, tucked between 2 tall filing cabinets that leaned slightly left, as if conspiring. She had worked there for nearly 10 years. The same chair, the same clunky monitor, the same view of the courthouse clock that always ran 5 minutes slow. In a world obsessed with upgrades, her life was one of quiet resistance. She liked it that way. There was something comforting in the rhythm of paper and pen, of names scribbled in margins, of order amidst the disorder. Outside of work, she had her mother to care for. Clara Harper, once a nurse, now a soft-spoken woman, fading slowly under the weight of early-onset Alzheimer's. Ellie's days were a series of gentle routines: work, groceries, doctor's appointments, dinner at 6, evening walks when the weather allowed. And sometimes, on the rare quiet evenings, she would pull out her old sketch pad and draw. Faces she passed on the street, a bench she liked near Colonial Lake, the way sunlight filtered through Spanish moss at 3 p. Yes. There was no audience, no ambition, just moments, captured before they disappeared. That afternoon had begun like any other, slow, predictable, and filled with the scratch of pencil on a budget report, until the door flew open. The wind came first, rushing through the narrow hallway like a wave breaking against stone. It carried the smell of something distant: cedar, maybe, or cold leather. Ellie looked up, startled, and saw him. He stood in the doorway, tall, still, slightly windblown. His coat was dark, well cut, but lightly dusted with dried leaves from the sidewalk. His hair, the kind that probably refused to stay down, no matter how much effort he gave it, curled slightly at the temples. His eyes gray, sharp, took in the room with a kind of unspoken expectation. Not arrogance, not entitlement, just certainty. He didn't smile, but he didn't need to. "May I help you?" Ellie asked, standing now, her palms flat on the worn surface of her desk. "I was told this is the records office for a municipal planning," he said. His voice was steady, lower than she expected. Every syllable was measured. "It is," she replied, brushing a curl behind her ear. "Though we don't get many walk-ins in suits like yours." He glanced down at his clothes, as if surprised to find them there. Then back up. "I'm Graham Whitmore." The name landed like a dropped book in a quiet room. She knew it. Of course. Everyone did. Whitmore Renewables. One of the youngest CEOs in the Southeast. His company had been making headlines for turning abandoned urban sites into green housing and tech hubs. There were rumors vague but insistent that he had his eye on this very neighborhood. People whispered about it in elevators and over lunch breaks. Most thought it was inevitable. Progress, they said. But Ellie didn't think of it as progress. Not if it meant losing what made this part of the city human. Still, she didn't let the name rattle her. Instead, she pulled out the intake clipboard and slid it across the desk. Along with her favorite pen, a wooden rollerball with smooth edges and a faint engraving on the side, C.A. He picked it up without hesitation, but as he began to write, he paused. His thumb traced over the initials. "Yours?" he asked. Ellie shook her head. "My father's." He left it behind when he retired. Graham nodded once, as if tucking that detail away in a quiet corner of his mind. Then he wrote swiftly and handed it back. She flipped to the appropriate folder, marked Historic Property Zoning District B, and handed it to him without ceremony. He took it, pulled out a leather notebook from his coat pocket, and sat in the nearest chair without asking. For a few minutes, the only sound in the room was the hum of the heater and the occasional creak of wood settling. She tried not to look at him, but failed. There was something about the way he sat, not slouched, not stiff, but deliberately poised that made the chair seem less like government furniture and more like something carved for him alone. He read quickly, jotting down occasional notes, his brows furrowed not in confusion but calculation. Ellie watched, curious despite herself, what brought men like him into spaces like hers, and why, beneath the polish. Did he look exhausted? Not tired? Exactly. Not the kind you sleep off, but something else. Something hollowed out and quietly guarded. After 15 minutes, he stood, nodded once in thanks, and reached to return the pen. Ellie waved it off. "Keep it," she said. "There's a whole drawer full of plastic ones that don't mean anything." He looked at the pen again, really looked at it, then slipped it into his coat pocket. When he left, the wind returned, tugging the door shut behind him with a low groan. Ellie sat back down, her fingers still resting on the keyboard, unmoving. She stared at the place where he had stood, wondering how someone could carry so much energy into a room and yet leave it feeling strangely quiet. And she didn't know, not then, that the man in the hallway would become the reason her world would shift. All because of one word she hadn't said yet. He came with plans and papers. She came with silence and tea. And between them sat a desk that had seen more resignation letters than promotions. It had been 3 days since Graham Whitmore walked through the old door of the planning office, leaving behind a gust of wind and a borrowed pen with someone else's initials. Ellie thought he wouldn't return. Men like him didn't usually linger in places like this, not when their calendars were color-coded by the hour, and their phones vibrated more than they rang. But on Monday morning, he walked back in. This time, the wind was quieter, but his presence still pulled the room into a different kind of focus. He carried a black leather briefcase, a scarf folded neatly over one arm, and the same unreadable expression that made Ellie feel as if he were listening to thoughts she hadn't spoken. She looked up from her inbox, half expecting him to ask for more files or clarification on zoning codes. Instead, he nodded once and said, "My team is reworking the HVAC at our Charleston office. They've relocated me here for the week. Here." The word hung awkwardly in the air, like a guest who wasn't sure whether to sit or apologize. Before she could respond, her supervisor appeared, clearly flustered. Graham had already called ahead, of course arranged the temporary workspace, requested access to documents, even confirmed coffee preferences. All that was left was the small matter of Ellie now being assigned as his liaison. "Temporary," her supervisor whispered. "Just a few days." Ellie nodded, biting the inside of her cheek. She didn't mind helping. Not exactly. But there was something oddly invasive about a man like Graham being stationed at a desk just a few feet from hers. A man whose entire world moved faster, louder, and larger than the one she had so carefully chosen to live in. His new workspace was across from hers, near the window that faced the courthouse lawn. The desk had belonged to a clerk who had retired 3 years ago and never been replaced. Dust had gathered in the corners of the drawers, along with a half-used bottle of whiteout and a broken ruler. Ellie cleared it all away before Graham arrived the next morning. By midweek, the rhythm began to shift. He worked with precision, speaking only when necessary. But his silences weren't cold. They were deliberate, respectful, even. Ellie, in turn, did her best to stay professional, but the boundaries blurred more easily than she expected. It started with small things, a shared stapler, a brief comment about the ancient heater, a mutual sigh when the copier jammed for the third time in an hour. On Wednesday afternoon, as the office quieted and the sun began to paint long shadows across the floor, Graham looked up from his laptop. "You've been here a while," he said. Ellie, who was organizing incoming permit applications, glanced up. "Since 2013. You like it?" She hesitated, considering the question. It wasn't one people asked in a place like this. Most assumed you were here because you had nowhere else to be, or no one else to be. "I don't mind it," she answered finally. "It's quiet, predictable." He nodded, then tilted his head slightly. "Seems like you could be somewhere else, doing something else." Ellie smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Not all things are meant to go fast. He looked at her for a long second, as if memorizing the phrase. That night, Ellie stayed late to organize a backlog of records no one had touched since the Clinton administration. She had just started the kettle in the break room when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned, expecting the janitor or her supervisor, but found Graham leaning against the doorway, his coat folded over one arm. "I didn't think you'd still be here," he said. "I wasn't planning on it," she replied. He nodded toward the electric kettle. "Is that the famous tea I've heard so much about?" She raised an eyebrow. "Famous?" He gave a faint smile. "Well, infamous. The building smells like chamomile every day at 3. I figured someone must be keeping tradition alive." Ellie chuckled softly. Guilty. Without waiting for an invitation, he stepped in and took 2 mismatched mugs from the shelf. They weren't fancy, one was chipped. The other had a faded slogan from a local insurance company. But he handled them with the kind of care reserved for fragile things. They didn't talk much while the tea steeped, just moved around each other in the tiny space, as if they'd done it a dozen times before. He sat on the edge of the counter. She leaned against the filing cabinet. When the timer dinged, she poured and handed him a mug. They sipped in silence. It wasn't awkward, it was companionable. And in that moment, just a Thursday evening in a government building where nothing much ever changed, Ellie felt something stir. Not attraction, not yet, but curiosity. The kind that rises slowly, like the steam from a cup of tea, warm and persistent. He didn't ask about the tea again, but he showed up the next day at the same time, just as the kettle started to whistle. Sometimes, the things we never say speak the loudest. And Graham was starting to hear them in the way Eleanor moved around a room. She didn't speak unless necessary, but her silences were never empty. They carried weight, the kind built from years of listening more than talking, of observing instead of performing. Graham, who lived in a world of constant declarations and rapid decisions, found her presence curiously steadying. She wasn't trying to impress anyone, least of all him. On Thursday afternoon, just before closing, he noticed a small sketch pad peeking out from under a stack of files on Ellie's desk. It was half covered by a zoning map and a paperclip tin. The edges of the pages were soft, worn from use, and the corners curled upwards slightly like leaves that had been turned by time and touch. She didn't seem to realize it was visible, or perhaps she did and just didn't mind. He said nothing about it, but the next morning, as they waited for the ancient copier to warm up, its wheezing almost comical, in contrast to Graham's sleek tablet, Ellie handed him a page, torn cleanly from the sketch pad. He looked down and found a simple pencil drawing. Nothing dramatic, no grand statements, just a hallway. Their hallway. The narrow corridor outside the break room, drawn in soft lines and quiet shading. In the foreground, 2 co-workers leaned against the wall, laughing over a joke he would never hear. In the background, light filtered through the window in long beams, illuminating dust particles mid-air like stars caught in daylight. He stared at it longer than he intended. "You notice things people miss," he said. "Carefully?" Ellie shrugged, her eyes on the copier, which was still blinking its stubborn red light. "That's what happens when you're not being watched." The copier let out a groan and began to spit paper. But Graham wasn't paying attention anymore. He looked at her, not the drawing this time, but the artist. He saw how she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear absent-mindedly, how her thumb rubbed the edge of her own knuckle when she was thinking. Small details, easy to overlook, but once noticed, impossible to unsee. Later that afternoon, as the office grew quieter and the sun began to settle into its golden descent, Graham found himself lingering longer than usual. The files he came to review were already neatly stacked in his briefcase. There was no real reason to stay. Still, he did. Ellie was reorganizing the supply cabinet, restocking envelopes and sorting faded labels. She moved with the efficiency of someone who had learned to find peace in the mundane. Graham watched her for a while, then spoke not out of obligation, but something else. "My father used to say, if you control the chaos, you'll never be crushed by it." She turned slightly, still crouched near the bottom shelf. Did it work? Maybe for him? For me? I'm not sure. I think I just got better at hiding the cracks. It was the first time he had spoken about his father, and it came out with less effort than he expected. Ellie didn't fill the silence. She simply stood up, dusted off her palms, and looked at him not with pity, not even with sympathy, just presence, the kind that asked nothing and gave everything. He wasn't used to it. He walked back to his desk, and for a while, they worked without speaking. The air between them was calm, easy, until Graham, stretching to plug in his laptop charger, accidentally knocked over the manila folder Ellie had left on the corner of her desk. Papers scattered. He bent to help reflexively, without thought, and paused as his eyes caught a photograph tucked between two budget reports. It was a candid image, black and white, slightly grainy, a hospital room. In it, an older woman lay in a bed, smiling faintly at the camera. Her hand rested atop another hand Ellie's, though her expression seemed distant, unfocused. Graham picked it up, instinctively trying to align the edges. Ellie turned around, saw what he was holding, and froze. Something flickered across her face. Not anger, exactly, but something colder, sharper. She reached for the photo without a word, slid it back into the folder, and closed it with a quiet, deliberate motion. The silence that followed was heavier than any conversation they had ever shared. "I didn't mean to," Graham began, but she had already turned back to her computer. "It's fine," she said, too quickly. "Happens all the time." It didn't. He knew it didn't. The room felt suddenly smaller. The desk between them, a simple slab of wood with a squeaky drawer, now seemed like a barrier. Not just physical, but emotional. She didn't look at him again that afternoon. At 5:03, she stood, gathered her things, and slipped the sketch pad back into her drawer. The kettle remained unused. Graham lingered, unsure of whether to speak again. But he sensed the line had been drawn, even if he hadn't meant to cross it. So he left. And Ellie stood by the window long after he was gone, her coat still draped over the back of her chair, the photograph tucked safely away in the folder, now labeled private. Outside, the wind stirred the brittle leaves on the sidewalk, lifting them just high enough to remind her how easily things could be moved, even when you tried so hard to keep them still. She told herself it didn't matter, but his absence felt louder than his presence. Sometimes the smallest word becomes the loudest turning point. And for Eleanor, that word was just 2 letters long. It had been 2 weeks since the hallway sketch, since the tea, since the quiet, careful building of something that had no name and even fewer expectations. They hadn't spoken of the photograph, nor of the awkward silence that followed. Instead, they continued side by side like 2 people reading different books in the same room. Separate stories, somehow sharing space. Graham still arrived at 8:15 each morning, Ellie still brought in her own tea leaves in a jar with a faded label. And most days, they moved around each other with the kind of ease that didn't need narration. But something had shifted. Ellie felt it in the way he lingered longer after work, asking questions not about permits or forms, but about her mother's favorite music, her first memory of drawing, the little bakery 2 blocks down that only locals knew how to find. She answered, cautiously, measured. It wasn't distrust, it was protection. So, when he asked her to join him for a walk at lunch that Thursday just a few blocks, to get some air, she agreed, more out of curiosity than comfort. The air was crisp, the Charleston sun generous in its autumn light. They passed iron gates and Spanish moss, the scent of jasmine lingering like a soft reminder that life here moves slower, older, more rooted. They stopped at a bench near the waterfront. It was there, with the sound of the tide brushing against stone and the cries of seagulls in the distance, that he said it. "I want you to come to New York." Ellie turned to him, brows lifting not in joy or surprise, but confusion. "What I want you to work with me," he clarified, "as my assistant, my real assistant." She blinked, unsure if he was joking. "You already have assistants. I have people who manage my calendar and shield my phone, but no one I trust with the things that matter." There was no grand gesture, no persuasive speech, just that one sentence, placed gently between them like a delicate package waiting to be unwrapped. Ellie laughed, quietly. It wasn't cruel, just disbelieving. "You can't be serious." "I am." She shook her head, the smile already fading. "You don't know me well enough to say that. I know how you see things. I know you listen without trying to fix. I know you remember what matters." He meant it as a compliment, but the weight of it landed differently in her chest. "I'm not a project," she said softly. "I never said you were." The wind tugged at the hem of her sweater. She crossed her arms, more from habit than cold. "You think I could just leave pickup and go?" Her voice was still calm, but the undercurrent was steady now, resolute. "My mother is sick. I'm her only caregiver. This job, however boring, allows me to be there when she needs me, to pay the bills, to sleep under the same roof she's known for 40 years. I understand. No. Graham, you don't. Your life is private jets and boardrooms and retreats in Aspen. Mine is grocery lists and co-pays and worrying if the hot water will last through the weekend." He didn't flinch. He just listened. "And even if I could leave," she continued, "I wouldn't want to be someone's assistant not in that world. I'd be nothing more than a concierge with better stationery." He exhaled slowly. "That's not how I see it." But it's how they'd see me, and how I'd start to see myself. I've worked too hard to know my worth in quiet spaces to become invisible again in a louder one. She wasn't angry. That was the strangest part. Just honest. She looked at him then, really looked past the tailored coat and polished shoes, past the soft-spoken charm and thoughtful pauses. She saw the man who had tried to offer her something he thought was a gift, not realizing it came wrapped in expectations she never asked to carry. So, "No," she said, gently. "My answer is no." And there it was. The word, small, final, unapologetic. Graham didn't argue. He didn't retreat into pride or embarrassment. He simply nodded, his jaw tightening just slightly. "I thought maybe it was worth asking," he said after a moment. "It was," she replied, "and I'm grateful. Truly." They sat in silence for a while, not because there was nothing left to say, but because the most important part had already been spoken. For Graham, it wasn't the rejection that stayed with him. It was the way she had said no with kindness, with clarity, with a kind of self-respect he hadn't seen in the circles he'd spent his life spinning in. She didn't owe him flattery. She didn't soften her truth to make him more comfortable. And somehow, that made him feel seen more than any yes ever could. They walked back without touching, back through the Spanish moss and the rustling leaves, back into the quiet hum of fluorescent lights and clicking keyboards. He didn't stay late that afternoon. He left before the tea kettle had a chance to whistle. But Ellie stood at her desk long after he was gone, her fingers lightly brushing the edge of her sketch pad, wondering when a simple word had last made her feel so heavy. He had made a career out of getting what he wanted. But that day, Graham Whitmore walked away with empty hands and a heavy chest. Ellie hadn't expected him to vanish so quickly. There was no goodbye email, no parting message. One morning, his temporary desk was cleared, the chair pushed in with that quiet finality that spoke of decisions made in silence. The only thing left behind was a mug porcelain, with a faint chip on the handle, still faintly scented with Earl Grey. She washed it and placed it on the shelf behind her desk. She didn't know why. The office returned to its usual rhythm. Phones rang, keys clicked. The copy machine groaned through its stubborn age. But for Ellie, everything felt just a bit off, as though someone had shifted the frame of her life by half an inch. Nothing had changed, and yet nothing felt quite the same. People noticed. They always did. Eventually, "Where's your New York friend?" asked Mr. Danner from Records, peering over the rim of his glasses. "Haven't seen Mr. Tall and Handsome lately," chimed in Janine from Payroll. "Guess big city types don't stay long," muttered the security guard as she signed in one morning. Ellie always smiled politely, shrugged, said something about schedules or meetings. Then she'd return to her desk, pull out a form, and let the silence fill the spaces he used to occupy. She didn't miss him. At least, that's what she told herself. But she missed the way the tea kettle had someone to wait for, the way lunchtime no longer had accidental walks that turned into conversations, the way she'd started looking at the world through someone else's curiosity. 2 weeks passed, then 3. One Thursday afternoon, as Ellie was sorting through mail that smelled faintly of ink and rain, she noticed a folded newspaper on the break room table. The headline caught her eye, not because of its size, but because of the name nestled within Whitmore Group withdraws from Charleston redevelopment project. She froze. The article was short, barely more than a blip. No statement from the CEO, no explanation offered. Just confirmation the multi-million-dollar commercial project that had been poised to transform the historic quarter into high-end condos and retail had been abandoned. She reread the line twice. Then, a few days later, a second article arrived, this time passed to her by Janine, who waved it like a flag. "You're going to want to see this," she said, eyes bright with a mix of curiosity and something softer, maybe awe. The page was full color, a rendering, watercolor soft, of a low brick building surrounded by trees, children laughing, artists painting on easels. The headline read, "New Community Arts Center to open on historic site, Clara's Corner, to honor local legacy." Ellie felt her knees buckle, just slightly. The article explained that the land, once slated for commercial development, had been donated by an anonymous donor through the Whitmore Foundation. The center would serve underserved artists, local youth, and caregivers of those with chronic illnesses. And its name, Clara's Corner, was chosen to reflect the warmth, resilience, and quiet strength of one Charleston family whose story moved us deeply. Her mother's name in print. It took her 3 attempts to read the rest of the article through the film of tears that blurred the words. Graham hadn't called, he hadn't written, he hadn't asked permission, but she knew. This was him, not the CEO, not the man in tailored coats, but the man who sat quietly beside her on a worn bench and listened without needing to speak. He had taken her no and turned it into something beautiful. She didn't tell anyone what it meant, not even Janine, who watched her carefully for a reaction. Ellie just folded the article and slipped it into her sketch pad, tucking it between a drawing of the old hallways and another of her mother's hands resting in her own. In the days that followed, Ellie found herself walking past the empty lot more often. The construction fence had been taken down. In its place stood a wooden sign, hand-painted in deep green, "Coming soon." Clara's Corner, a place for art, memory, and community. Below it, in smaller script, sponsored by the Whitmore Foundation. She touched the edge of the sign one afternoon, tracing the letters slowly, no fanfare, no spotlight, just quiet impact. That night, She brewed 2 cups of tea. One she drank slowly, letting the steam rise into the hush of her small kitchen. The other she left on the windowsill, cooling under the first stars of early evening. She knew he wouldn't come back, not in the way he had been before, but somehow he had never really left, because somewhere, in the silence between her breaths, she heard that word again. No, only now. It didn't sound like a wall. It sounded like a door, a beginning, disguised as refusal, a shift, gently rooted in the courage to choose herself. And for the first time in a long time, Eleanor Harper let herself wonder not what she had. Ellie Harper's apartment smelled faintly of turpentine and chamomile. The dining table, long unused for dining, had disappeared beneath an ocean of sketchbooks, loose sheets, charcoal pencils, and tiny jars of watercolor. The walls, once bare, were now breathing in faces she had seen in line at the pharmacy, hands that held subway railings, eyes that met hers for only a second before moving on. Small, ordinary moments, captured with the attention of someone who knew how easily things slipped away. There was one drawing she hadn't put up. It was of a man seated at a desk too small for his frame, shoulders hunched, eyes tired not from lack of sleep, but from carrying too many expectations for too long. In the sketch, a tea mug rested in his hand. The steam rose gently, as though trying to lift some invisible burden. She kept that one in her drawer. Sometimes, at night, she'd take it out and just look, not to judge the lines or the shading, but to remember, the way someone had once entered her life like a gust of wind and somehow managed to make everything still. Weeks passed, and then, one afternoon, a letter arrived. It wasn't typed. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, addressed by hand. Her name, Eleanor Harper, written in dark blue ink with a steadiness that made her throat tighten. No return address. Just the scent of something familiar. She held it for a full day before opening it. Inside was one sheet of paper, folded with care. The letter was brief, no plea, no apology, just a thank you. Thank you for not letting me forget who I am, it said, and thank you for the word that reminded me some things are more valuable than yes. She read it once, then again, and again. And then she placed it back in the envelope and tucked it beside the sketch of the man at the desk. She didn't write back, not because she didn't want to, but because she didn't know how to say what she felt, not in sentences, not yet. Her language had always been lines and shadows, color and quiet. She wasn't ready to translate her heart into words. One gray morning, just before Thanksgiving, she found herself standing in front of Clara's corner. It wasn't open yet. The front doors were still boarded while contractors worked inside. But the painted sign had been hung wooden, hand-carved, just as it appeared in the newspaper rendering. She stood there for a long while. Inside, she imagined echoes of children's laughter, the scratch of pencils on paper, the smell of acrylic paint. A woman like her, years ago, quietly finding a corner where her voice didn't have to be loud to be heard. She didn't go in, not yet. Instead, she turned and walked the long way home, through streets lined with sycamore trees and slow-turning leaves. She stopped at the old bench near the post office where Graham had once waited out a rainstorm with her and sat in the fading light. And for the first time, she pulled out a blank sheet from her notebook and began sketching without a plan. Her hands moved gently, almost without thought. Later, back at her apartment, she pinned the sketch on the wall beside the kitchen. It was a picture of a door, half open. Meanwhile, across the city, Graham sat in a small corner office he had never intended to use. It was part of a new wing of the Whitmore Foundation. Humble compared to his past offices. The desk was made of reclaimed wood. The chair creaked. The window overlooked a bus stop and a row of food carts. But for the first time in years, he didn't feel watched. He felt present. There were other letters he had written, none of them mailed. He had written one the night Ellie had said no. Another when he walked through the construction site and saw the first mural being painted. One more on the day he saw her from a distance standing outside Clara's corner, her coat tugged tight against the wind. Each letter said something different. All of them said the same thing. I haven't forgotten. But he never sent them, because part of him knew some things couldn't be rushed. Not healing, not forgiveness, not love, and certainly not someone like Ellie Harper. She was not a chapter he could skim. She was the book he had to read slowly, line by line. The winter settled in. With it came a certain stillness. Ellie worked during the day and painted at night. Graham attended meetings with social workers, teachers, community organizers, people who didn't care about his balance sheets but cared deeply about his promises. Neither of them reached out, but both felt the weight of the unsent words. And somehow, in that unspoken space between them, something held. A thread not cut, just waiting. Because sometimes, love doesn't begin with grand gestures. Sometimes, it begins with absence. The space someone leaves when they go, and the way that space refuses to be filled by anyone else. Thursday afternoons used to mean little to Eleanor Harper. But now, without quite realizing it, they had become an hour carved out of habit and held together by hope. It was subtle. So subtle she barely acknowledged it. A glance toward the window at 3:57 p.m., the way she slowed her typings when the hallway grew quiet, the softness with which she refilled the tea kettle. Even if no one else ever drank from it, she didn't expect him to walk through the door. But she hadn't stopped listening for his footsteps either. At work, her desk remained the same, orderly, familiar, the dusty plant by the corner, the drawer that stuck when pulled too fast, the squeaky third key on the keyboard. She had returned to her old routines, but something had shifted in the rhythm. There was more pause between her sentences, more quiet between her smiles, the kind of quiet that waited, but pretended not to. Every now and then, someone would stop by and say, "Whatever happened to that tall man who used to come in here?" Ellie would shrug lightly, as if she barely remembered. But the truth was, she remembered everything. The way his coat always carried the smell of autumn air, the particular way he held a pen, loose between long fingers, tapping it once before making a decision. How he drank tea like he was unfamiliar with the ritual, but liked that someone else had thought to prepare it for him. She remembered how it felt to be seen not for her efficiency, not for her politeness, but for the things she noticed when no one else did. Ellie had started sketching more, late at night. After caring for her mother, she would sit in her room with the window cracked open just enough to let in the cool Charleston air. One sketch stayed with her longer than the rest. She had drawn it 4 times, torn it up 3. It was a simple scene, a man seated at a round table, one hand on a ceramic mug, his other resting near an empty chair. His face wasn't fully visible, not in any version she could finish. It wasn't that she couldn't draw him. She could. She had memorized every line. But finishing it would have meant accepting that he wasn't coming back. So, instead, she let the drawings live halfway, the way hope does when it's not ready to give up. At the office, life buzzed on as usual. Deadlines, filing, schedules, an endless rhythm of responsibilities. One Tuesday, in the middle of a budget review meeting, a younger colleague mentioned an article she'd read. Crazy, right? That Whitmore guy, he gave up a multi-million-dollar commercial deal. People say it was for some personal reason, like super personal. Ellie didn't look up. She just adjusted the pen in her hand and said, "People do unexpected things sometimes." That night, she came home to a quiet apartment. Her mother was already asleep, the television humming softly in the background with an old black and white film. Ellie made herself tea 2 cups, out of habit, and drank alone. Then, just as she was washing her mug, her phone buzzed. A message from the front desk at work. "There's an envelope on your desk. No name, just says personal." The next morning, it was there. Same thick cream envelope, same handwriting. She opened it slowly. Just 2 lines. "If you're ever ready for tea again, same time, Clara's Corner, no date, no pressure, no expectations, just a place, and the possibility of something unfinished. That Thursday." Ellie didn't look at the window right at 4 p.m. She stood on her front porch instead, wrapped in a cardigan that had belonged to her mother back when the world felt slower. The sky was painted in burnt orange and dusty blue, and the wind carried the crispness of early winter. She sat on the porch swing and held her tea with both hands. She didn't rush to a decision. She didn't even decide that night. But she did one thing. She left the kettle on the stove, just in case. It wasn't the tea she missed. It was the quiet between two people who had nothing to prove. The bell above the door jingled softly, though no one turned to look. The community center smelled of paint still drying and pinewood polish, the kind of scent that made Ellie think of new beginnings and freshly sharpened pencils. She stepped in slowly, like someone entering a memory she wasn't sure was hers to revisit. The name Clara's Corner was painted in soft cursive above the reception desk, a mural of daffodils blooming behind it, her mother's favorite flower. A photo of Clara as a young woman hung beside it. Ellie hadn't known they would hang it there. It stole her breath a little. She had come not to reclaim anything, but to see if something quietly true still existed. The art room was at the end of the hall. She hesitated outside it, fingers grazing the wall as if it might anchor her nerves. Then, with the kind of courage that builds quietly over weeks, she pushed the door open. There he was. Graham sat at a round table, his coat draped over the back of the chair, a steaming cup of tea before him. Not business-suited or sharp-eyed as he once appeared in headlines, but relaxed, perhaps even softer. He looked up when she entered, but didn't rise or speak. He just smiled, the same smile that didn't demand anything. There was another cup on the table, same kind as before, ceramic with a slight chip on the handle. She walked to it and sat down across from him. No fanfare, no questions. Just the shared sound of spoons stirring against porcelain and the creak of chairs settling under familiar weight. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was comforting in a way only two people who had once bared their truths and then retreated could share. The weeks apart had stretched and bent and tested something between them, but had not broken it. She sipped her tea. He did the same. It was still strong, still a little bitter, still perfect. She ran a finger over the table's grain. She moved into Rose Hill last Thursday, she said softly. Graham nodded, as if he already knew who she meant. It's quieter at home now, but the kind of quiet that feels loud. He looked at her with understanding that didn't need words. She appreciated that about him, the absence of rush, the presence of space. I visit every evening, she continued. She doesn't always remember, but when she does, she asks about the kettle, says she still hears it whistling even when she dreams. Ellie's eyes didn't water. They just softened. She used to tell me tea fixes everything, she added. And does it? Graham asked gently. She shrugged. Not everything, but it helps you sit still long enough to feel what needs fixing. They sat like that for a while, tea cooling slowly, afternoon light casting golden shadows across the table. Then Graham spoke. My father stepped down last month. Officially this time, no titles left to hold on to. Ellie raised an eyebrow. And how does that sit with him? Graham gave a half smile. He calls it peace. But I think it's just a different kind of war now, between who he was and who he thought he had to be. She nodded slowly, as if the statement lived in her own bones. Two. And you? She asked after a moment. No suits, no headlines lately. I didn't change the world, Graham said quietly. But I started with one building. He gestured gently around them. And one woman. The weight of his words settled between them, not heavy, but full. Ellie looked at him for a long time, not because she didn't understand, but because she did. Fully, deeply. She didn't say anything right away. Words, she had learned, often get in the way of real things. Instead, she reached for the teapot and refilled his cup. A small act, but louder than any reply. They talked a bit after that. Not about grand plans or past regrets, but about light things. Real things. The kind of things two people share not to impress each other, but simply to be seen. He asked if she was still drawing. She said yes, but not people lately. Just windows. He asked why. She said, because windows wait. They don't chase or pull. They just offer light. Graham smiled. That was the moment she knew he still understood her. Not because of what she said, but because he didn't try to fix it. As the sun lowered outside, casting long rays through the high windows, the silence came back. But this time, it didn't linger as absence. It was presence. Sometimes, healing begins not with answers, but with showing up. She had shown up. It had become a quiet ritual. Every Thursday at 4 o'clock, she walked to Clara's corner with a thermos of black tea, a small paper bag of almond cookies, and the knowledge that Graham Whitmore would already be there, waiting in the corner room with the window that faced west. They didn't talk about what happened before the offer, the refusal, the weeks in between, and they never talked about what this was. It was not romance in any usual form. There were no labels, no plans, no promises, but there was presence, and sometimes that was enough. Ellie liked to arrive a few minutes early just to see if he'd notice. He always did. He would glance up from the newspaper or the sketchbook she'd given him weeks ago. He didn't draw much, but sometimes she saw the faint outlines of birds or rooftops on the page. His hands moved clumsily, like a man relearning how to be still. They talked about ordinary things, how the azaleas in the garden were taking longer to bloom this year, how the children's art classes were filling up faster than expected, how her mother had taken to calling every nurse darlin', regardless of gender. Nothing important, everything essential. Sometimes they said nothing at all. She liked those silences best. They didn't press in, they settled like soft blankets, comforting and unspoken. One Thursday, after the tea had gone cold and the cookies were gone, Ellie stood up instead of saying goodbye. "Come with me," she said simply. He followed without asking why. They walked through the back hallway of the center, past a room filled with instruments, another echoing with soft footsteps from a dance class. Then, through a nondescript door with a small window covered in frosted film. She unlocked it with a small silver key. Inside was a studio bare, except for a wooden easel, a scarred table lined with brushes, and 3 walls covered in pinned-up sketches, half-painted canvases, and color tests. The air smelled of turpentine and something older. Maybe dust, or maybe memory. "This was my room," she said, flicking on the soft yellow light overhead. Graham stepped in quietly, letting his eyes wander. There were drawings of alleyways and windows, of women sitting alone on benches, of hands holding teacups, of shoes waiting by doors. None of them looked quite finished, but none of them felt forgotten either. He paused in front of a canvas near the far wall. It showed the outline of a man not clearly defined, more like a silhouette made from shadow and afternoon light sitting by a window, a cup in his hand, staring not outward, but inward. "I know this one," he said softly. Ellie didn't respond. "I think you finished this one," he added, his voice barely above a whisper. She stared at the painting, her arms wrapped loosely around herself. The silence pressed in, not heavy, but deep, not uncomfortable, but unrelenting. And then, as if some quiet dam inside her had cracked, Ellie began to cry. Not loud sobs, just the kind of tears that fell without force, like rain that had waited too long to come. They slid down her cheeks and onto her collar, soaking into the neckline of her sweater before she even reached up to wipe them. It wasn't what he said that broke her open. It was what he didn't say. No apology, no pleading, no, "I told you so." Just the acknowledgement that something inside her had already begun to shift, and that maybe she didn't have to fight it anymore. Graham didn't move toward her. He stayed where he was, giving her space. That, too, was something she had come to admire. He never tried to rush her grief or fix her silence. He had learned how to wait, the same way a house waits for someone to come home. When she finally looked up, her eyes were red, but clear. "I used to come here when the world felt too loud," she said, her voice low and a little hoarse. "And I'd start painting because I thought maybe, if I put enough of myself on the wall, I wouldn't feel so invisible." Graham nodded, his hands resting gently in his coat pockets. "But I never finished any of them," she added. "I thought I wasn't ready." She looked back at the painting again. "Now I think I was just afraid of what it would mean if I did." He didn't answer, because he didn't need to. She stepped closer to the painting, not to touch it, just to see it from his side. And in that still room, surrounded by brushes and ghosts and all the things left undone, something inside her settled. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't even a kiss, but it was real. And in that room full of half-finished things, something finally felt whole. It didn't happen in a boardroom or a press release. It happened on a park bench, in a quiet corner of the world they built together. The invitation came on a Tuesday morning. It wasn't gilded or embossed, just a simple cream-colored card, slipped inside a plain envelope, left on Eleanor's desk with a folded note that read, "If you're free, I'd like you to stand beside me." The event was a fundraiser for the community development arm of Clara's Corner, something that had grown from a single renovated building into a series of programs touching lives across Charleston. It was being held in the city's botanical gardens, under twinkling cafe lights strung between old oak trees. Ellie stared at the card for a long time. She didn't like events, or spotlights, or the sound of amplified microphones echoing across manicured lawns. She didn't like how people whispered in corners or measured you with glances and tight-lipped smiles. More than that, she didn't want to be mistaken for someone who simply rode shotgun in another man's story. And Graham? Well, Graham was still Graham, even after all the quiet Thursdays, after all the tea. He was still the man with headlines behind his name. People still looked at him like he was a mountain steadfast, looming, impossible to move. She wasn't sure where that left her. "I don't think I belong in those rooms," she finally told him. They were walking past the garden beds outside the center, where a few kids were learning how to plant fall vegetables. Graham was wearing rolled-up sleeves and holding a spade. His hands were dirty. It made her smile. "You belong in any room I walk into," he said simply. She didn't reply. "I don't want you to come as my +1, he added. "I want you there because you are this place. You're the reason I remember what success actually looks like." Ellie bent down to pull a weed from the edge of the walkway. The silence stretched long between them. But when she stood up, she looked him in the eye. "Okay," she whispered. "But I'm not wearing heels." The night of the event arrived with a soft breeze and the scent of autumn magnolias drifting across the lawn. Ellie wore a deep blue dress, not fancy, but thoughtful. A string of her mother's old pearls rested at her collarbone. Graham met her at the entrance. He didn't say she looked beautiful. He didn't have to. They walked in together, side by side, not arm in arm, not posed, not pretending, just there. People came up to them. Introductions were made. There were polite nods and curious glances and warm handshakes from faces Ellie didn't recognize. She kept her answers short, her smile gentle. But as the night wore on, she noticed something. They weren't asking about Graham's empire. They were asking about Clara's Corner, about the children who'd found mentors there, about the elderly woman who painted her first watercolor at 72, about the single mother who learned bookkeeping and opened her own bakery. And they were asking Eleanor, not because she stood next to him, but because she'd stood in that building before it ever had a name. When it was time for speeches, Graham stepped up to the small stage. He looked handsome, of course, but not like the magazine covers or the glossy press kits. He looked settled, like a man who'd finally made peace with the weight he used to carry. He spoke briefly. He talked about legacy, about learning that buildings don't change lives, people do. About how he once thought power came from acquisition, but now knew it came from attention. Then he did something Ellie didn't expect. He looked straight at her, and he said, "The most important decision I ever made in business was listening to someone who told me no." A soft murmur moved through the crowd. She didn't want recognition, he continued. She didn't want a promotion. She just wanted to protect what mattered, and in doing so, she reminded me what really matters. He paused, and so, tonight, I'm stepping back. Another murmur. I'm giving full creative and operational leadership of Clara's Corner to the person who's been leading it all along, whether she knew it or not. He gestured toward her, to Eleanor Harper. There was no applause at first, just a hush. Ellie felt the warmth rise in her throat, behind her eyes, down her arms. She didn't move. She couldn't. Graham met her gaze not demanding, not expecting, just holding space. And then, like a wave, the crowd began to clap. Slowly at first, then louder, fuller. She stepped forward, not toward the stage, but toward the small park bench near the garden edge. She sat down, closed her eyes, breathed. When she opened them again, he was beside her. He didn't say a word, and he didn't need to. Later that night, under a soft Charleston sky, she walked back through the garden with her shoes in her hand. The grass was cool beneath her feet. Her heart was quieter than it had been in years. She had spent most of her life sitting behind a desk, answering phones, organizing someone else's day. She had measured her worth in how well she stayed out of the way. But tonight, something changed. In that moment, she didn't feel like a secretary who once said no. She felt like a woman who finally said yes to herself. 6 months had passed. The air in Charleston had shifted once more warmer now, touched with jasmine and evening rain. And with it, Clara's Corner had bloomed into something Ellie couldn't have imagined back when it was just an idea on a city development memo. The community center was alive, not in the noisy way of crowded malls or business towers, but in the steady hum of belonging. There was a painting class on Tuesdays for seniors who'd never held a brush before. A small reading room where widowers met over poetry and peppermint tea. There was a garden out back, tended by children who laughed more with their hands in the dirt. And on Sunday afternoons, there was a tradition now known simply as quiet tea, where no one spoke unless they truly had something to say. The walls of the building had changed too. Where once there was peeling paint and flickering bulbs, there were now canvases, dozens of them framed with care. Not masterpieces, just real moments, captured with honesty. An old man napping with a book on his chest. A young woman sketching with a toddler in her lap. A teenage boy teaching his grandmother how to use email. This was their kingdom, not grand, not loud, but built with intention and love and the kind of time no one seems to have anymore. Ellie lived upstairs now, just above the east wing, in a small apartment with mismatched furniture, hardwood floors that creaked, and a window that caught the afternoon sun perfectly around 3:15 p.m. She had painted the walls herself in soft gray, and hung dried flowers from her mother's old vases on narrow wooden shelves. It wasn't fancy, but it was hers. Most mornings, she woke up before dawn, made coffee in the chipped blue kettle she refused to replace, and sat in silence watching the light return to the city. Some days she painted, some days she just breathed, and every weekend, Graham arrived, never in suits, sometimes in flannel, often in jeans. He came without agenda, no spreadsheets, no schedules, just a bag of groceries, a box of loose-leaf tea, and once, a bundle of new paintbrushes tied together with string. He stayed in the guest room, 2 doors down the hall, always asked before entering the kitchen, always took off his shoes. Sometimes, he fixed things: wobbly chairs, leaking faucets, burned-out bulbs. Sometimes, he just sat beside her as she answered emails or labeled art supplies. She never asked him to, and he never offered as though it were charity. It was simply what they did. They had never spoken the words. No, I love you. No promises, no plans. But in every gesture, every quiet Friday night spent sorting art submissions. Every evening he swept the front porch while she watered the ferns. It was clear they had chosen each other, not out of need, not out of rescue, but out of recognition. One Saturday evening, as the center quieted and the last of the volunteer crew waved goodbye, Ellie asked Graham to wait a moment before heading back to the guest room. She disappeared into the studio. When she returned, she carried a canvas, carefully wrapped in soft linen. She placed it on the table between them, and with fingers that trembled only slightly, she unveiled it. It was a painting, more detailed than most. Rich with soft light and shadow. A hallway narrow, familiar with a woman standing near a desk and a man just entering through a doorway, the wind pushing in behind him. Her hand was extended, offering something, a pen, perhaps, his expression unreadable, but his presence undeniable. It was the first day they met. Ellie looked at him, her voice barely more than breath. "I call it the moment I said no." Graham didn't speak right away. He leaned forward, eyes tracing every line, every stroke of color. He didn't ask what the objects meant. He didn't need to. He knew. The hallway wasn't just a space. It was a crossing, a quiet collision, and her refusal, polite, unwavering, hadn't ended something. It had begun everything. After a long moment, he said softly, "That's the moment I found home." Ellie swallowed hard, her hands folding in her lap. It wasn't about the art, she knew. It was about the truth she'd finally allowed herself to name, that she wasn't a footnote in someone else's story. She wasn't a supporting character. She was the one who saw what others missed, the one who noticed stillness, who made space for change, the one who stayed when it mattered and who walked away when it didn't. She didn't just belong in the frame. She had painted it. Later, as the sky faded into velvet and the scent of tea leaves lingered in the air, they sat on the back steps of Clara's corner, sharing a small plate of ginger cookies and the comfort of long-earned silence. They didn't speak of love. They didn't need to. It was already there in the chipped cup he refilled without asking, in the blanket she laid across his knees when the breeze picked up, in the painting that now hung near the front entrance, for all who walked in to see. A moment captured, a kingdom built, and two people who understood that sometimes. The quietest places are the ones that echo longest. Every storm leaves behind a different sky. Hers came with art, tea, and a man who finally learned how to sit still. It rained that morning, not the hurried kind of rain that rushes through gutters and disappears as quickly as it came. This was slow rain, soft, steady, and thoughtful. The kind of rain that felt more like a memory than a forecast. Ellie sat on the front porch of Clara's corner, her knees tucked under a worn blanket, steam rising from her teacup as drops tapped rhythmically against the old tin roof. The sky was a quiet gray, not heavy, but full. Inside, the center was still. The usual weekend laughter of volunteers had been paused for the weather. A few stayed behind, reading quietly in corners or sketching by window light. She didn't mind the silence. It wrapped around her like something familiar, something earned. Graham stepped out a few moments later, holding 2 cups of tea, each cradled in both hands to keep them warm. He didn't say anything, just handed one to her and sat beside her on the wooden bench, shoulders brushing gently. No one had to fill the space between them anymore. The storm had passed long ago. What remained was a shared porch, the scent of wet earth, and the kind of peace that didn't come from answers but from the right kind of questions. Finally asked, Ellie took a sip. The tea had steeped just right, no bitterness, just warmth. A distant thunder rumbled, not threatening, just present, like an old friend announcing their arrival. She turned to Graham. "This feels familiar." He glanced at her. The rain. The stillness. He nodded, a soft smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "It's been exactly 1 year," she said, his brow raised, but he didn't interrupt. "Since the day you walked in asking for a pen," a chuckle escaped his throat, "and you handed me your father's." She nodded, didn't realize until later. "I guess some part of me already knew you weren't just passing through." They sat in silence again. Birds chirped somewhere beneath the porch awning, undeterred by the drizzle. A few leaves clung stubbornly to the oak tree in the front yard, refusing to let go even as fall insisted. Ellie reached into her lap and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook. She flipped it open, revealing a blank page, and with a pen, her father's, still working after all this time, she wrote, "Some storms don't destroy. They make space." She stared at the words, letting them settle. Then, slowly, she closed the book. It wasn't about Graham anymore, not entirely. It was about what he represented, what that storm had shaken loose. For years, she had lived quietly, efficiently, deliberately, holding the world at arm's length, offering what was needed, but never too much. Then came a man who didn't demand more, but who stayed long enough to notice what she never said out loud. He had brought with him chaos, discomfort, change, and, oddly, peace. The kind of peace that comes not from solitude, but from being understood by someone who doesn't ask you to explain. Graham stood up, stretched, and walked to the edge of the porch. Rain dotted the toes of his shoes, but he didn't step back. Instead, he turned to her. "Come here," he said gently. She joined him, barefoot now, the wooden floor cool beneath her feet. Together, they looked out at the rain. The garden beyond the path shimmered with puddles. A swing tied to a tree swayed slightly in the breeze. Graham lifted the latch on the old porch window and pushed it open, letting in the scent of petrichor and jasmine. Ellie closed her eyes and breathed in deep. It didn't feel like a storm anymore. It felt like room. No promises were made that day. No vows, no announcements, just two people, standing side by side, understanding that their lives had intertwined not through declarations, but through presence. He reached for the teapot and poured her a second cup without asking. She didn't thank him. She didn't need to. Later, after the rain had slowed and the porch lights flickered on, they remained watching clouds drift, the world recalibrate, the earth drinking slowly from the sky. In the quiet, she thought of all the moments that had brought her here. The hallway, the desk, the refusal. She had said no, not because she didn't care, but because she finally did. And that made all the difference. Not every love begins with yes. Sometimes, it starts with a no. Brave enough to mean something, and someone strong enough to listen. In a world that often praises speed, ambition, and loud success, this story reminds us of the quiet power of stillness. Eleanor didn't chase a bigger life, she chose a deeper one. And sometimes, that's the braver choice. She said no, not out of fear, but out of clarity. She stayed not because she was stuck, but because she understood the weight of presence, of care, of home. Graham, a man who had spent his life building empires, learned that some of the strongest foundations are made not of steel, but of listening, of slowing down long enough to see what really matters. Their journey teaches us that love doesn't always come wrapped in grand gestures. Sometimes it's in a cup of tea, a quiet hallway, a painting never signed, and often the most life-changing choices begin with two simple words: no, thank you, because no can be a boundary, but it can also be an invitation to honor your truth, to protect what matters, and to make room for the life that fits you best. So, slow down, listen deeper, and don't be afraid of the storm. It may be clearing space for something beautiful. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If it touched your heart, made you pause, or reminded you of something you've quietly carried, then it's done what it was meant to do. If you believe in the power of quiet stories and gentle healing, please like, share, and subscribe to support this channel. Your presence here means more than you know. Until the next story, take care of your heart.